For many decades, there have been links between the White House and organised crime. Let's check it out. I'm James Gladwish and welcome to OC Shorts, bringing you detailed historical snapshots of the American Mafia and other organised crime. Feel free to subscribe if you like that sort of thing. I sat down with historian and author Eric Dezenhall to discuss how the White House and organised crime have been connected throughout history. In his early career, Eric Dezenhall worked as an aide in President Ronald Reagan's White House. And in 2001, he studied and chronicled Meyer Lansky's personal diaries. He is now an award-winning author of 12 books. His new book, Wise Guys and the White House, Gangsters, Presidents and the Deals They Made, is a fascinating account of the relationship between mobsters and the government. I've included the link for this excellent book in the comments below. In this conversation, we discuss just a handful of the interesting topics that are found in the book. So the book covers organised crime links to the White House going back for the best part of 80 years, including Charlie Luciano's deal with the authorities to help protect the New York waterfront during World War II. There are some arguments that suggest that although there were definitely meetings held with the Office of Naval Intelligence and mobsters connected with Luciano, the actual impact on World War II that came out of these meetings was questionable. What were your findings with regards to this, Eric?
I think that people tend to look at two extremes. You have the people who will tell you that it was all nonsense, it was all a scam. And then you have other people who will tell you Luciano was storming ashore in Sicily with a big flag waving the letter L. Both are ridiculous. I mean, the problem is people get a little insane with the stuff. The truth is the help was sought by the government and the help was received. And do I think it changed the course of the war? No. Do I believe that the program made it inhospitable to Nazi sympathizers, of which there were many around the New York ports? Absolutely. Do I believe that that the people Meyer Lansky brought into naval intelligence helped Patton's army understand the terrain and meet contacts over there? No question. But I think that, like a lot of stuff with the mob, people tend to be overwrought. It's one or the other. And the fact is look, if you were drafted for the military and you served. Whether or not you turned the war is another story. But a lot of the things that were interesting to me were the personal details. For example, Roosevelt appointed his best friend to be in charge of the waterfront. And that was a guy named Vincent Astor, who today would be a billionaire. So he was intimately interested in it. The other thing was Roosevelt's top propagandist was Walter Winchell, the reporter. Who was Walter Winchell's neighbor in New York? Meyer Lansky. And I have a great story where Meyer approaches Winchell in the lobby of their apartment and says, Walter, you gave me a bum steer. You gave me this address where the Nazis were. They weren't there. And Winchell's like, he's scared. And he goes, Meyer, I'm so sorry. And Meyer says, don't worry, Walter. We found them. And so you have these personal stories, which are, to me, what makes it interesting.
The book also covers President Joe Biden's early connections with organised crime. Can you expand on this a little, please?
Well, Biden had colorful ancestors, and it was really his father that had these very kind of sleazy ties. And for example, he was tied to these old bootleggers who had all of these scams going. One of them was a grave vault racket. They were selling these asphalt grave vaults that turned out to be pretty much of a scam. I mean, they didn't work. They weren't super seal proof. They were also became government contractors, and they were selling this kind of equipment that supposedly made ships waterproof, and that turned out to be a scam. And some of the people they were connected to were involved with bootlegging. The one that was most interesting to me is the one that's most relevant to Biden personally, which is when he ran for Senate in 1972. He was a kid. He was 29. He wasn't doing very well. And he was running against an incumbent that was about to hit him on the eve of the election with these really tough ads in Delaware newspapers. Well, on the eve of the election, Frank Sheeran, the Teamsters official who was affiliated with my hometown mob family, the Brunos, made sure. Oh, and by the way, the Brunos controlled the Delaware region. The Teamsters made sure that the newspapers attacking Biden were never picked up, distributed. They never got delivered. And so here, this ad campaign that was going to hit him hard, and there really weren't TV ads in any big way in those days. The ads never got out, and Biden eked out a victory. So, whether Biden personally knew all of this was going on is a separate point, but there's no question that he benefited from Sheeran's intervention.
So do you believe that potentially there may have been people in Biden's kind of camp who had those kind of connections or had, what's your thoughts? Like I said,
Well, growing up in that region, the Philadelphia Delaware Valley, I mean, it's called the Delaware Valley, is filled with mob figures, and you couldn't do business with labor without having rubbed against those people. And I think that what's interesting is whenever people talk about mob involvement in politics, it doesn't necessarily mean Tony Accardo was going into the Oval Office personally at 3 in the morning. That's not how it works. But it does mean that somebody somewhere in the food chain was connected to that world. And if you wanted labor support in the Delaware Valley in 1972, you had to deal with the Teamsters, you had to deal with a mob figure. Who did it? We can't be sure, but Biden certainly benefited from it.
the book also covers a section on how Lyndon Johnson and the FBI used a mobster to assist in hunting down the killers of civil rights activists in Mississippi. I assume this is the Greg Scarpa affair. Can you touch on this a bit more for our viewers?
Well, I think that there's been a lot of truth and a lot of mythology about the whole civil rights story, and some of the accounts have been questioned. But one of the things about this much 60 years in time passing is people start talking more records start coming out, and some of the people I talked to in federal law enforcement had a clearer sense of what happened. There is some question that Scarpa was actively involved in finding the bodies of the three civil rights workers. My bet is that he probably did have some involvement. But there were other civil rights atrocities, and there is no question in my mind that Scarpa was called in to torture KKK people to help solve those crimes. What was interesting is if you listen to the tapes, you have Lyndon Johnson saying to J. Edgar Hoover, I don't care what you have to do. I don't care what you have to do. And so Hoover has this problem. He's not good on civil rights. His boss is good on civil rights. Hoover didn't care about civil rights, but he has to crank out a solution to these crimes. And so what he does is they had just flipped Greg Scarpa, and he puts the arm on people to do whatever it takes, because that's what Johnson asked. And the tool that they reached for was Greg Scarpa. And I think that what I'd show in some of the documents is that Hoover did not want it to be known to any grand jury who was used to solve these crimes. And
Yeah.
there's no reason to believe that Hoover went into Lyndon Johnson and said, here's how we really did it. No, what did he do? He went into LBJ and said, we used our crack team of investigators and we went undercover and we solved the crime. What he didn't say is we had this mass murderer do it. And that's what's so interesting. And the FBI, by the way, over the years, they've denied this. What I was able to get is people on background from that era to say, we have come to accept that most of this actually happened.
Yeah, because it's fascinating. Because obviously the whole Mississippi burning scenario, isn't it? With the three black activists, sorry, the civil
Yes.
rights activists. But there's
Yeah.
also another story about, I think it was a black storefront owner who.
Vernon Damer.
That's the one, yes. And I think sometimes the stories get confused. But as you said, there's obviously evidence to say that they did utilize him, maybe on more than one occasion.
Well, that's right. And they did use him on more than one occasion. And I think what happens is, look, part of the problem with writing about the mob world and the spy world, as I do, is everybody's lying to you Okay. So you have somebody like Scarpa, who I don't doubt said, I did this, I did that. I mean, I run into mobsters who will tell you, you could bring up any crime. You could say, hey, how about Julius Caesar getting stabbed? And they'll go, let me tell you how that really went down. That wasn't Brutus and Cassius. That was Joey Bag of Donuts. They know everything. And so you have some of that with Scarpa. But when you shake all this stuff loose, what you do have is the fact that he was involved with solving these crimes, or at least some of them. The Vernon Dahmer one, there's no question in my
Yeah.
mind he was involved. The Mississippi burning one, I think he probably had some involvement, but I don't think that it's everything that he and his girlfriend said they did.
Your book also covers President Trump's historical organized crime connections. What can the viewers expect to learn about this from your book?
What makes Trump unique is, of all of these presidents, all this stuff was covered up, but Trump openly admits to having dealt with mobsters. He's been on national television bragging about it. It's part of his brand. And Donald Trump drives people crazy when somebody says, you did this unethical thing. And he says, that just makes me smart. The reality is only Trump could do. Only Trump could get on television and say, yeah, I dealt with the mob. Absolutely. They were nice people. And so that's what makes it different, because the everything else in the book was covered up for a long time. I mean, I grew up near Atlantic City, and one of my uncles said to me once, this was probably 35 years ago, this Trump guy, he's a genius. And I said, really? I thought he drove 4 casinos into the ground. And my uncle said, do you know how hard that is? And so what I learned is how Trump dealt with the mob is the key thing, which is that he did things that were technically legal. He overpaid for properties. He bought a property Salvie Testa owned that was worth 195,000. He bought it for 1.1 million. There's no law against paying too much.
Yeah.
In New York City, rather than using steel for Trump Tower, he used concrete. He simply paid a lot. This is how he compensated the mob. And so when my prosecutor friends say he dealt with the mob, what I say is, if you look at the history of the mob and the presidency and business, it is the politicians and the businessmen who knew how to use them that did better than the mobsters themselves. And so when Trump says, hey, the way I did it just makes me smart, whether you love him or hate him, he may actually be right, because one of the key points of the book is people like Joe Kennedy, who was not a bootlegger, but who was able to find ways to technically do things legally. These were the people who prospered. And the politicians who took advantage of the mob were the guys who prospered. And what drives people crazy is it ruins their idea that the mob is behind everything.
Yeah.
Yeah, the mob was very prevalent. But the fact is the federal government is bigger and they're scarier. And if you know how to use these guys and you know what they fear, you can get a lot done.
Eric Dezenhall's book, Wise Guys in the White House, features further stories and facts on a whole host of politicians, including Harry Truman, Ronald Reagan, John F. Kennedy, and Richard Nixon, and mobsters such as Sam Giancana, Vincent Alo, Chin Gigante, Meyer Lansky, and many more. As mentioned earlier, this book is a fascinating read, and I've included the link to it in the comments below. I hope you found that interesting. Thanks for watching.